Alright, there's no way we can deploy our Azure Functions API project yet for Bugporter, because if we deploy this without authentication, then anyone's going to be able to come along and use our API without authenticating. So before we can get a minimum viable product for our API deployed, let's set up authentication. So instead of reinventing the wheel and writing our own, probably flawed authentication backend, let's instead leverage and integrate with a third-party authentication provider. And the third-party authentication provider we're going to use is Firebase Authentication. So why Firebase Authentication? Well, for one, it's free for most use cases, which is great. Two, I found the developer experience to be quite pleasant, which pretty much goes for all of Firebase products. And three, it is the third-party auth provider that I'm most familiar with. So I've used this in the past with plenty of .NET projects, including projects that I've already done on my channel, and I can't think of any issues I've ever had with Firebase Authentication. So let's stick with it. That said, I already have a sprint set up for integrating Firebase Authentication with our Azure Functions API project. So we're going to create our Firebase project, connect to our Firebase project from our Azure Functions project, and then add authentication to the report bug function that we implemented last time. So let's start this sprint and integrate Firebase Authentication. So step one, let's create a Firebase project for our application. So let's go to the Firebase console where we can create our Firebase project. So I'll leave a link to the console in the description, and you'll need a Google account in order to create a project. But let's add a project. Our project will be named Bugporter. Let's continue. We're not going to enable Google Analytics on this project for now. Maybe we'll get into Google Analytics later if we get into creating a web client, but let's move forward without it for now and create our project. And success, project created. Our project is ready. Let's go. All right, so while we're in the Firebase console, let's move over to authentication. So let's go to build and select authentication, and let's select get started. So set up authentication in our project, and we need to configure a sign-in method for our project. So for now, we're only going to enable email/password as our sign-in method. And the reason we're not going to integrate with any of these other OAuth providers for now is because integrating with these is tricky when you don't have a web client already set up. And right now we don't have any client, so email/password is going to be the best option for now. And if we go ahead and create a WPF application or a MAUI application as our client in the future, it still might be tricky to integrate with these OAuth providers, so I'm not sure if we'll touch these other providers yet. But let's go with email/password for now. Let's enable that and continue. And there we go, email/password sign-in is enabled. So on that note, we can close out our first story of creating our Firebase project. That is complete. And now that we have our Firebase project, let's connect to it from our Azure Functions project. So let's move that over. So if we want to connect to our Firebase project from our Azure Functions API, the first thing we're going to need is the Firebase admin SDK. So in our API, let's manage NuGet packages, and we're going to search for Firebase admin. So this is the admin SDK. This is the server-side module for integrating with Firebase, and we can use this to integrate with Firebase Authentication. So let's install that. There we go, all good. So with the Firebase admin SDK, we want to initialize a Firebase app that points to our Firebase project. And we're going to register that Firebase app in dependency injection so that we can use it throughout our application, such as when we authenticate users. So let's go over to our startup.cs where we configure dependency injection. Let's create our Firebase app. So we use Firebase app.create, which is part of Firebase admin. Make sure you have that imported. And with this Firebase app, let's just register that in dependency injection. We'll register it as a singleton and just have one instance throughout our application, which we initialize when our function starts up. So obviously we want this Firebase app to point to and use our Firebase project, but we're not passing any kind of secret key or authentication mechanism that'll allow this Firebase app to use our Firebase resources. And if we start our API without passing credentials to a Firebase project, our app initialization is gonna fail. So when we create our Firebase app, let's pass in some app options. And on these app options, we can set a credential that's gonna allow us to authenticate with our Firebase project and ultimately connect to it. So this credential we can load up using Google credential from JSON. I found that storing the Google credential as JSON is the easiest way for development as well as in production. And we can load this JSON credential from our application configuration. So on our configuration, we can extract some kind of Firebase config. Let's get that in a variable, and we can take our configuration and get a value. We'll just call this Firebase config. So in development, we can load the raw Firebase config JSON from our local.settings.json. And in production, we'll be able to configure this value in the Azure console. So how do we get this Firebase config? Well, if we head back to our project in the Firebase console, we can select this little gear next to project overview and go to project settings. And we want to go to service accounts, and we want to generate a new private key that's going to allow us to connect to the Firebase admin SDK. So let's generate that key, and it should download some JSON. Here we go. So open up this JSON in whatever your favorite text editor is. I'll just go ahead and open mine in the browser. But let's select all of this JSON and copy it. And let's find some kind of JSON to string converter. And here we go. Let's go to tools.knowledgewalls.com, JSON to string. Looks like I visited this in the past, so it must have worked in the past. Let's go to this. I'll leave a link to this in the description too. And let's paste in our Firebase config JSON and convert that. Let's copy the output, move back to our project, and we want to add that Firebase config JSON to our settings with the key of Firebase config. So for development, let's go to our local.settings.json and add that key, Firebase config, and paste in our Firebase config JSON. And the JSON should be stringified to one line, and we should also be escaping all the quotation marks within the JSON. And just a reminder, if it's not obvious, this Firebase config JSON, the service account for our Firebase project, is sensitive. Do not commit this to source control or let it leak. In our project, we already have this local.settings.json file get ignored, so we should be good with protecting this value. So let's throw down a breakpoint in our function startup, and if our Firebase configuration is set up correctly, our Firebase app should initialize, and we should hit this breakpoint. So let's start up, and boom, hit the breakpoint. Our Firebase app initialized successfully, which means our credential was valid, and we connected to our Firebase project. And connecting to our Firebase project was what this story was all about. So let's close this out. We have connected to our Firebase project from our Azure Functions API. That's done, which means we can connect to Firebase Authentication and authenticate users incoming to the report bug function. So let's get started with adding Firebase Authentication. Finally. So when clients make a request to our Azure function, they're going to pass up a Firebase token, and we're going to use the Firebase admin SDK to verify that token so that we can authenticate the user and process the request if they're authenticated. So to verify Firebase tokens, we're going to use a NuGet package that I created in the past. I have a whole tutorial where I go in depth with verifying Firebase tokens, so I'll be sure to link that. But we'll use the NuGet package for now. And in the past, when I created this NuGet package, it only worked for ASP.NET authentication, but I've recently generalized this to work for Azure Functions as well. So in our project, let's go to Manage NuGet Packages, and we're going to search for Firebase Admin Authentication .dependency injection. So this package wraps Firebase Admin and allows us to easily authenticate Firebase users. So let's install this. And now let's get into setting up authentication. So authentication in Azure Functions is different than an ASP.NET web application because in ASP.NET, of course, we can just add authentication in our dependency injection setup and then use the handy authorize attribute in our controllers to easily enforce authentication. But in Azure Functions, there is no authorize attribute. We would have to create our own authorize attribute manually. So down the road, we might create our own authorize attribute, But for now, we're just going to run authentication manually and explicitly at the beginning of our function execution. So we want to enforce authentication on this report bug function. So to do that, we're going to use something called a Firebase Authentication function handler, which is part of the Firebase admin authentication.dependency injection package that we just installed. So let's get this injected through the constructor. Let's add a parameter for that and set that field. And we can use that authentication handler when we execute our function to enforce authentication. So let's take our authentication handler and we can call handle authenticate async. And this takes an HTTP request that we want to authenticate. And currently we don't have that on our function method. We just have this report bug request, which is just pretty much a DTO. But in Azure Functions, we can just add another parameter for the HTTP request, and Azure Functions will automatically populate this, so we can pass this into the authentication handler, and that's going to contain things like headers. So our authentication handler is going to be able to extract the Firebase token from the authorization header and authenticate the user. So we can look at this authentication result, and if authentication did not succeed, we're going to return unauthorized, which is essentially just a 401 status code. Alright, so before we can test this, we need to register this Firebase Authentication function handler in dependency injection. So in our function startup, we can just do a builder.services, and we're going to use add Firebase Authentication from our NuGet package. So let's import that. Again, that's Firebase admin authentication.dependency injection. And with that, let's test this out. So in order to authenticate, of course, first we're going to have to create a user, and we can do that using the Firebase API. But we're going to have to pass up a API key for our project. So we can grab that from the Firebase console. So in our project settings, if we move back to general, we can copy this web API key here. So let's copy that and paste it as a query param in this Firebase API that we're going to hit to sign up a new user. I'll drop this endpoint in the description so that you can easily copy it. But got our API key set as the key param. And in the body of this request, we need to pass an email, a password, and we can also pass return secure token as true. And that means when we sign up, we'll get back a Firebase token, and we won't have to go through and hit the login endpoint after this. We'll already have a Firebase token that we can pass to our Azure function. So let's sign up, and there we go, 200 success status code. Let's copy this ID token, which is very big. So copy that, and then let's move back over to our post request to our bugs endpoint. So if we send this request now without passing our Firebase token, we should get a 401 unauthorized. There we go. But now if we go to our headers and pass up an authorization header, which we prefix with bearer, and then we paste in our Firebase token, send this request. There we go. Authentication succeeded, and we reported our bug, which actually isn't a bug because everything works. We should also add some logging here with the ID of the authenticated user. So let's use our logger to log that. But first we're going to extract the user ID from our authenticated user. So conveniently, this authenticate result contains claims from the Firebase token that we decoded, such as the user ID. So let's extract that user ID from the authentication result. We can dig into the claims principal, and we want to find the first claim, which has a key of Firebase user claim type .id. So this Firebase user claim type is part of Firebase admin authentication .dependency injection, and this is the key that contains, of course, the user ID. So let's grab the value of that key, and we'll simply log it. So we'll say something like authenticated user, pass in their user ID. So let's test this out again. There we go, authentication succeeded. We log out the user ID. We can look at that value. There we go. And we can see that log line was written out in our functions console. And with that, hooray, we've added authentication. We can go ahead and commit these changes. Let's go ahead and close out this last story and complete our sprint. Complete sprint. Well, let me do it. There we go, sprint completed. Okay. And now, when we deploy to production soon, we won't have anonymous users hitting and spamming our function. So just to summarize, we created a Firebase project, and then we used the Firebase Admin SDK to connect our Azure function to our Firebase project, and then we used our Firebase Admin Authentication helper package to easily add Firebase Authentication to our Azure function. So hopefully you can apply these concepts to your own Azure Functions project to enforce authentication via Firebase. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.